Well, if you would, turn with me to Psalm 139. As you're turning there, I just want to encourage you, let me tell you where we find the psalmist of Israel, David, in Psalm 139. He is, at this point, utterly struck by his father's guiding, infinitely wise hand of divine leadership upon his shoulder. And he is struck with his own inability to escape that leadership. If there was ever a passage of Scripture that encapsulates the grace of God's inescapable leadership of his children, this would be it. Now, today is Father's Day, and happy Father's Day to you men in this room, you fathers in this room. I want you to know, though, I chose this text before I even knew this was Father's Day. And here we are, and this text is, by the Lord's providence, a very fitting passage for us today. To give you a little background of the psalm, as it says at the heading, it is a psalm of David. Now, David wrote this for the chief musician to play, and if you know my heart here at Cornerstone, my heart is to do music ministry with you all, hopefully for the rest of my life, if the Lord allows. And this was David's heart for Israel as well. And now he's writing this for kind of a leader under him, Asaph, to sing this to the congregation of Israel. And David would have been there singing, and he was David's chief musician. Let me just tell you, in our modern day, worship songs are pretty anemic with how we write them. And when we look at Psalm 139, you're going to see the way that music ministry was intended for God's people. Imagine all of Israel singing this psalm as we study it. Now, I've titled this message today, The Grace of God's Inescapable Leadership. And if you know this psalm at all, you might be wondering, how is this psalm about leadership? How is this psalm about leadership? Well, 5 times in this psalm, God's leadership is mentioned explicitly, and it's alluded to in the entire psalm. And in this first section, we're going to see that God uses his comprehensive knowledge of us to lead us. So today with David, we're going to have 6 realizations of God's leadership. And the first is this. The first realization today in this text is the realization that God's leadership is perfectly informed. God's leadership is perfectly informed. And this sets God apart from everyone else. Everyone. Let's read this first section. Verse 1, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You've enclosed me behind and before, and you have put your hand upon me. That's leadership language. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. Think about this for a moment. David is a great and a wise leader in Israel. He is the leader of Israel. And he says God's knowledge is so high and God's wisdom is so high that he could never attain to it. Every leader in all of history has never been perfectly informed. They have never had all the data. Never. They have never been able to perfectly interpret all the data, even if they had it. And so their leadership, to some degree, is always faulty. Think about this. Even Satan, in his leadership of rebellion in heaven, has never been this informed. He was with God, but he did not have God's infinite knowledge. A knowledge that has no limits, no end, a comprehensively intimate knowledge, a perfect knowledge. And David is recognizing this, and it's impacting him to the core of his own thoughts. Look at these 2 verbs that God performs on us, as David says in verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. In the Hebrew, this first section it's a series of perfect tense verbs. And if you know about perfect tense verbs, they often describe something that God has already done in the past that has a current or even a future ongoing result. And David is saying that God has already searched me and he has already known me, and that's still happening right now. Does that make you tremble a bit? It did for me this week. The one who holds every atom of the universe together has searched me and knows everything about me. Everything. And there's no changing that because it already happened, and it is happening. And you will see that this knowledge, though, is for our protection. This is the kindness of God in this passage. As we go through this, I want you to take note, God is incredibly active in this psalm. Everything about this psalm is God acting. He's always moving and acting and working and leading and guiding. And his knowledge, it does things. It's not just like our knowledge. Sometimes we take knowledge and we just store that away. We don't do anything with it. God's knowledge is a knowledge that works towards an end. It searches, it sifts, it guides, it hedges. Look at what it says. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. And you are intimately acquainted with my ways. So what does God know about us? Well, it says, you know when I sit down and when I rise up. And you know my thoughts from afar. You understand them. David is describing here actions and thoughts. Two different realms that are connected. And he says, God, you know when I sit down. You know that. You know everything about when I, even just a simple task like sitting down. You see that. You know that. You know what we do. You know our actions. For us, when we sat down on our couch last night, the Lord knew that. And when we rose up this morning, the Lord knew that. And what about yesterday morning when we rose up and got out of bed? The Lord knew that, and he saw that, and he saw everything that you did. Every detail of your life and what you've done while you're up, and he's seen that your whole life. And if that's not enough, God understands your thought life. Think about that. You understand my thoughts from afar. The thought life that is within you, that's inside of us, that's with you, that's actually who you are, wherever you go. This is what David is describing. Your inner conscious life. And he says in this verse that God understands that before it gets here. God is not bound by time. He knows your thought life before you live it. The way David describes this is by saying God understands your thought life from a distance. Now, he's not talking about proximity. David's addressing time. He's not saying God is far away in proximity to your thoughts. He's saying that God knows your thoughts from a distance before they arrive. God is everywhere at all times. So it can't be proximity unless, of course, he's speaking about a spiritual thought that distances you from God. But he's not. That's not the imagery. What he's talking about is the realm of foreknowledge. Speaking of time as distance. God understands my thought life from a distance before I think it. Christian, I think that should make you and I want to be very careful with our thought life. Guard your inner life because though it might be hidden from some, it is not hidden from the Lord. Now you might say, how can I be responsible for my thoughts if God already knows them before I think them? Well, my thoughts are my thoughts. God did not necessarily have a direct hand in generating my thoughts. That would be something like divine inspiration. That may be happening to David in this moment. But God speaks of thoughts as connected with intentions, and God's intentions are always good. Always. So what is God's role in this kind of foreknowledge that, by the way, David says is too high for him to even begin to grasp? I think Jeremiah 17:10 is helpful. And I want to illustrate something here, kind of a contrast to what David's talking about, but it's helpful. Just listen to this. Jeremiah 17:10. I, Yahweh, search the heart. I test the inmost being, even to give to each man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. So God's role in Jeremiah 17:10 is to judge. But in this psalm, David doesn't mention God as judge at all. So what is David talking about? He mentions God as the sovereign leader above all leaders. So God's role in this passage is to understand the thoughts of believers before we think them so that he can place his hand upon us and guide us according to knowledge. So that he can lead us according to knowledge. For lack of a better term, so that God can providence us. That's how the Lord works. Yes, God uses perfect information to judge us. Fully agree with that. But in this context, he's using it to care for us. And I think that should be a comfort to us, to shepherd us. And that may be the greatest, most convicting and comforting truth of all time. Now remember, this is poetry. It's a psalm. It's a song. And in the original language, you would see that David is describing his thoughts poetically as friends. And God is intimately acquainted with these friends before they even become guests in his house. And you have to kind of think of it this way. And I would ask, have you thought about your thoughts as if they're your friends? You might say, well, I didn't want to think those sinful thoughts. They just came in. Well, you might not be able to control the thoughts that drive down your street, but you don't have to open the door to them and invite them in and sit on the couch with them and entertain them. What you dwell on is your most intimate friends because they live in you. We might all have some friends in our thought life that we need to break relationships with. Those kinds of friends will poison you while you're sleeping. They get in your dreams because you have been having sinful thoughts. Don't open your curtains when they drive by. Don't invite them to the threshold of your door or into your chamber. God is already acquainted with them, and he has judged them as worthless. And they're his enemies, not his friends. So let your thoughts be God's friends as well as yours. So now the searching, verse 3, look how God searches us. It says, he scrutinizes my path and my lying down. That's a fascinating word in the Hebrew. It's the word for sifting or winnowing. Winnowing is what they would do to separate chaff from wheat, right? The winnowing process, this is when they would separate the grain from the chaff. They would toss it into the air with like a pitchfork, a winnowing fork. And all the worthless things would just blow away. And everything that was worth something, the heavier things, would fall to the ground and become useful. And you would gather it up and you would store it for future use. And God says he does this with our pathology, with our way of life. God understands the worthless things you do, and he separates them from the things that have value. Even when we're resting, even when we lie down, God is sifting out the motivations of what's truly valuable from what's truly worthless in our lives. He's intimately acquainted with all of our ways, it says. And the worthless things will be separated out. The idea is don't fill your lives with chaff. And don't think that your chaff does not affect the well-being of your soul. Now, this is interesting because the primary place that describes God like this in the New Testament is Matthew chapter 3. John the Baptist describes Jesus like this. His winnowing fork is in his hand. It's an interesting description. It's pretty wild, by the way, because, we draw these cartoon pictures of Satan with a pitchfork, right? And what John the Baptist says is that Christ is actually the real one with the pitchfork, with the winnowing fork, and he's the judge. He'll do the sifting. He's the one we need to fear and respect and honor. And so John the Baptist says he will thoroughly clear his threshing floor, and he will gather his wheat into the barn, and he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Isn't that just like our human hearts to soften what righteously belongs to Christ and place it on Satan in the form of a cartoon? But that's beside the point. Now, this is speaking in Matthew 3 about believers and unbelievers. But the truth is the same. The wheat that is separated from the chaff, the same thing with how we live in our inner lives, even as believers. So don't fill up your barns with chaff, or one day you'll watch Christ burn it. But remember, in this psalm, this is familial language. It's family. It's like family contrasted with strangers, and your family has a knowledge of your behavior, right? And your patterns like no one else. God, in this passage, is the Father who sees exactly how we live and how we think. And that should comfort us. That should be a comfort and a conviction, as it is for David, because it means we're not strangers in God's house. As a leader of my home, I want my kids to both be comforted and have a little fear because they know I'm really familiar with their patterns of life. That's the idea in this passage. God is the Father in the household of God, and the difference between human fathers and God is that God knows everything that happens all the time. Nothing gets past him. Nothing. God's leadership is perfectly informed. And here's where God's leadership begins to really shine through in this passage. God doesn't just have knowledge just to have it. He uses it to lead us, to protect us. So Christians in this room, verse 5 should be a great comfort to us. It's like Psalm 23, discipline and instruction. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. God, in his perfectly informed leadership in his house, puts boundaries around us. That helps us. He puts boundaries around us, and he places his hand on us. That's what it says. Verse 5, you have enclosed me behind and before. You have put your hand upon me with this knowledge. It's hedging language. God encapsulates us with our knowledge for our well-being. It's a perfect knowledge. And not only does he know the past and know what's coming, he puts his hand upon us in all of that. Even in the sin, the Lord, if we're believers, puts his hand upon us. And this is the only time in the Bible that this phrase is used exactly like this. We should ask, what does it mean for God's hand to be upon us? What does God's all-knowing hand do? Well, I'll just give you a couple passages that may help us kind of think through this topic, because the hand of God is mentioned all throughout Scripture. John 10, we know that no one can take God's sheep, Jesus' sheep, out of his hand. It's protection. Job 19:10, the hand of God has struck me, so the hand of God can bring trials, all within God's perfectly informed leadership. Ezra 7:9, the good hand of God was upon Ezra because he set his heart to study and obey God's law. God will bless that. And then Ezekiel 8, this is wild. While Ezekiel was in his house with the elders of Israel, the hand of God grabbed Ezekiel by the hair and suspended him between heaven and earth. I've never had that happen to me with God's hand. That's wild. So God's hand leads people. It takes people a direction, a place. It protects them. It covers them. It instructs them. It encourages them. It's providence. And every time you see this happen, God is describing himself assisting or providing care in a specific event or leading someone somewhere. It implies a sovereign, providential, all-knowing leadership. Providence, by the way, is not passive. The all-knowing, all-seeing, present everywhere God at all times is purposefully and intentionally orchestrating all things for his glory and for the good of his people. That's amazing. And this psalm emphasizes that. John Piper, by the way, describes providence as purposeful sovereignty. I think that's a great description here. Sovereignty that takes us a direction. Purposeful sovereignty. God doesn't just have to have knowledge to do nothing with it. God's knowledge is not just some dormant thing that exists in some theological box somewhere. God's knowledge accomplishes his will. It's working. It's always leading and taking a direction. It's an accomplishing knowledge, a purposeful sovereignty. His hand is upon us, and all of this could be summed up in one word: leadership. The God of the universe is leading the universe and you. That's amazing. For us believers, I think this should both convict and comfort us. God's leadership is not uninformed. It's not like he doesn't understand us. He understands us perfectly. So how should we respond to all this? Well, look what David does in his response. This knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too high. I cannot attain to it. David's saying, if that's who God is, I cannot be God in my life. I don't even understand my own thoughts and actions at the level that God does, let alone someone else's. I cannot be my own God. I cannot direct and orchestrate and lead my life for myself. That's the right response. And if you're doing that, let me warn you this morning, don't try to imagine that you can be your own God. Even if you had all that knowledge, you would not know what to do with it. There's no safety in that for you. You and I are sinful. We would not be able to lead ourselves the right direction even if we had infinite knowledge. But God does. We need to recognize the perfect knowledge of God and submit to it. Submit to his perfectly informed leadership in our lives. And now, David understands how crushing this is, right? This can feel crushing for lowly sinners like us. To have a God who knows all things. And he addresses the age-old response that goes way back to the garden. And I love that David goes to this direction. Think about it. The first people, Adam and Eve, tried to get an alternative knowledge by eating the fruit. A knowledge apart from God, a knowledge apart from his leadership. And then when they felt shame, what did they do? They tried to hide from the God who has infinite knowledge. They tried to get away from God. That's foolish. But David understands this thought process, and I think he's feeling a bit this way. And in verse 7, he says, "Where can I go from your spirit? And where can I flee from your presence of this all-knowing God who leads me and has his hand upon me?" We just covered the first realization that God's leadership is perfectly informed, but if that truth makes you want to hide from God, then you need the second realization to go with that. And our second realization today that David realizes with us is God's leadership is everywhere. It is everywhere. God's leadership is everywhere. Everyone else's leadership is finite. It exists in one sphere. God's leadership exists everywhere. It's as if David's demeanor in this portion of the Psalm, too, is that he wants to flee the universe. And so he says, verse 7, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? David's asking God an incredulous question that he himself attempts to answer. And the idea might be, where might I go from your spirit? And then he phrases the question another way. He says, where might I flee to get away from your presence? That's a transition in his conversation with God here. This is a prayer, but he's building on the previous section with questions. It's like David is saying, God, in light of our previous conversation about knowledge, I agree with all that. Now, where can I go to escape you? That's pretty pressing. This is why I've titled this message, The Grace of God's Inescapable Leadership. God's inescapable leadership is a grace to us. Otherwise, we would be destroyed under our own leadership or the leadership of Satan. I don't know about you, but I'm thankful I cannot get away from God. That is comforting to me. It's a great comfort to know that God is everywhere. And there's no place I can go in life or in death that he's not there. That is a great comfort. And here is David's attempt to illustrate back to God the inescapableness of God. David is learning that God is working, and he cannot escape that. And so he uses a series of verbs to describe these incredulous possibilities of escaping the presence of the ever-leading God. It's a series, what we would call the if-thens. You know, the first one's a contrast. If this, then that. There's kind of a result, a cause and result. If I make it to heaven, well, he says, then I know God's there. That's an easy one to understand. Verse 8, if I ascend to heaven, well, I know you're there. It's not a hard concept. Now, contrasting with that, if I make my bed in Sheol, which just means if I go to sleep where the dead are, God, you are there too. Now we have to deal with the theology of this for a moment. This is profound. Can the undying God exist where dead people are? And David's answer, you ready? Yes. God is everywhere. God is everywhere. You cannot escape him. Death is not an escape from God. If you thought for a moment that you could flee God by dying, that is impossible. And David says, God is even there. Now, David gives another if. And what comes after that might surprise you. But he says, if I take the wings of the morning and I dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Well, what is he saying? The wings of the morning, the uttermost parts of the sea. What is this? It's poetic language. And if you boil it down, most commentators would agree this is a poetic way of saying the light of dawn. If I go to the sunrise, how fast the light of dawn streaks across the sky. If I go from east to west, because the uttermost part of the sea often references the west in Hebrew poetry. If I go from east to west as fast as the speed of light, the speed of the dawn, can I get away from God? If I go the farthest I can, the fastest I can, in any direction, David says God is actually still there. But what is it about God that David says spans every direction infinitely? He's not just talking about God's presence. It's more specific than that. Look at the text, verse 10. Even there, your hand will lead me. It's interesting. David understands that God will lead him. David is saying, God is my leader no matter where I go, and in his presence, he never stops leading me, and his presence is everywhere. And he again uses this idea of God's hand. I think that should be a comfort to us. The hand of God leading us is the safest place we could possibly be. And David's just trying to wrap his mind around this inescapable leadership of God. And it's not just any hand, by the way, that's being described here. Verse 10, even there your hand will lead me. It's your right hand. Your right hand will lay hold of me. The right hand of God speaks to skill, of power, of authority, protection, transcendent providential leadership. Now, we know from the New Testament, James and John argued about being at the left and the right hand of God for some sort of status. But David here just realizes God's hand is upon me, and it's leading me, and I cannot escape it. Again, we must realize that God's leadership is perfectly informed and that God's leadership is everywhere. And the primary concept you're going to see from David in this entire psalm is that God's leadership is inescapable. You can't escape it by time. You cannot escape it by location. You can't escape it by special knowledge or darkness or your own thoughts, or even in the womb, as he goes on to say, before you're born, or in a crowd of wicked people. You still cannot escape God's leadership presence. It's inescapable. Verse 11, he says, if I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me and the light around me will be night. Well, then even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. The darkness and light are alike to you. You know, sin, by the way, is an interesting thing. David's response here is indicative of the experiential presence of sin. It doesn't necessarily mean David has sin in his life in this moment, but David understands what sin does. It's not necessarily blatant sin in his life. In fact, there's not even any sin in David mentioned in this entire psalm. So how do we know it's connected to David's response? Well, no one wanted to hide from God until there was sin. No one. We don't want to hide good things from God, but sin, we want to hide that from God. Look, we all know this, right? We all know this. We are descendants of Adam and Eve. Those thoughts in your mind that shouldn't be there, we would never want those thoughts to get legs and start walking around for everyone to see. We want to hide things. We want to hide that. We think there's some measure of protection for us to keep things in the dark. And yet the dark is oppressive. And that's why David says, if I say to myself, the darkness will overwhelm me, that's the word here. Well, then that doesn't work either. Even the overwhelming oppressiveness of darkness can't hide me from God. And that should be such a comfort if we're believers, because we want our sin to be exposed and to be dealt with rightly. That's why David says, if I say to myself, the darkness will overwhelm me. Well, again, if we preach to our own heart that this oppressiveness of hiding in the dark will protect us, and that the light is going to be dangerous to us, well, that might fool us, but it doesn't fool God. And believers, by the way, can do this. David understands this. David did this. It's instructive for us. David is correcting his own erring thought process with all these truths, and we should do the same. And he says, if I say the light around me will be night, well, what does that mean? The light becomes night around me. If I think that actually can hide me, being in the light. Well, I think we all know this. Some people are covered in darkness in broad daylight. You can see it all over them. It's like a cloud is over them that has no water, that's just over them. And that doesn't hide them. God can see through that. Even darkness is not dark to God. The light and the dark are the same to him. Deeds done in the dark are not hidden from God. But there's also a positive to this. The good things that no one sees, the Lord sees that. The things that are right and true and godly and just, the Lord knows that. That doesn't escape God either. If you've suffered an injustice, that doesn't escape God. He knows everything that's been done in the dark. He knows it all, and he's sifting it. Now, there's a transition in verse 13. David has another realization of God's leadership. And this actually is a realization that expounds on this idea that he cannot escape from God's leading knowledge and presence. And this third realization of David is that God's leadership is evident in us. We are walking examples of God's intelligent leadership. Isn't that amazing? We can't escape God's leadership because we actually display it by our very existence. In the grammar of this passage, it's good for us to connect verse 7 to verse 13. Where can I go from your spirit? Verse 7. Verse 13, well, you formed me. I can't get away from your spirit. Your spirit made my spirit. Our spirit, we're subjected to God's spirit. We can't flee him. We're made by him. We display his ownership, his wisdom, his intelligent design, his leadership, all of that. We display that. And quite literally in this, we are, in a spiritual sense, the offspring of God. And if we're God's children, we really are the offspring of God. Just like your father led to the creation of you, God is the source for all of us. And just like your children bear your resemblance, we all reflect God because we are his design. and he's made us in his image. Again, his intelligent leadership is on display in this passage. It's amazing. And we get to be the pedestal that walks around and holds that up. We're just walking pedestals broadcasting God's creative leadership in the whole universe. I think that's amazing. Now, I think this needs to be said here. The intentionality of God in the creation of every single human being is mind-blowing. This passage says God wove us together in our mother's womb. And this word for weaving is actually the Hebrew word for leading. To lead or to guide. They would use it like the hands of a skillful weaver to guide thread, to create something beautiful. And God does that. He weaves us into what we are. Everything is a function of leadership. God's leadership, ultimately. And we're proof of that. God wove us before we even understood that he existed. Isn't that amazing? Again, we are walking evidence of God's design. Now, there's a connection here to the fact that we can't hide from God, but he says he hides us for protection now. Now we're looking at the realm of the womb, and God hides us for protection while he builds something of us. It's just these incredible poetic connections of truth that David's making. And now, at this point, David just can't help himself. He is so moved by this fearful recognition of God's knowledge to now this thought process of how he might flee God. When he thinks about God creating him like this, though, now he just bursts into this doxological praise. And he bursts forth with these words, "I will give thanks to you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Do you praise God for how he's made you? God made you. God did that. Even the areas of sin and things that are around you, your circumstances, even in all that, none of that is outside of God's providence. Are you too busy comparing yourself to someone else? The Lord made you. Well, David doesn't want to hide anymore. He wants to give thanks. He wants to proclaim it. And his demeanor is totally changed. His demeanor is now this in this psalm. I have to worship God because of how he's made me. Praise God for his leadership from my mother's womb, is what David is saying. I am both fearful and in awe of how you've made me and been leading me from the womb. When we take an honest look at how God created us and guides us in our very conception, now we must admit that God's works are marvelous. They're absolutely marvelous. And our soul actually already knows this. And David recognizes that. He says, my soul knows this very well. He admits what some people are unwilling to admit their entire lives, that God's works are wonderful. They're perfect. Everything God does is perfection. And now David's going to circle back and say, you know what? I can never escape God's leading presence in my life because even at the moment of conception in my mother's womb, the minutest detail of my structure was not hidden from God. I was totally unknown to everyone else. In the world, I was made in secret. But as he says, I was skillfully woven together by God's leadership in the depths of the earth. What is David talking about when he says the depths of the earth? It's just a poetic way of talking about a location. He's saying, this is the part of human life where people don't see what happens. We don't see what happens. Marvelous things happen there, and no one sees it. And I'm here to tell you that God is doing this. The hiddenness is the depths of the earth, but he's talking about the womb where God creates us. Now, verse 16 here is really interesting. He says, your eyes saw me even when there was no substance formed. You saw me at conception. You saw my unshaped substance. Now, it's hard to wrap our minds around this. Do you remember when you were a child and you wondered, like, how did my parents get here before me? Right? You're kind of like, wait, how did that happen? You always felt like you were around. And then you hear your parents talk about this time when they're like, you were not around and they were making plans about you. And you're like, that's odd. I don't understand that. Well, maybe I'm strange, but when I was a kid, I had a very hard time understanding that. Very difficult time wrapping my mind around the fact that I haven't always been here. And what was it like when my parents made plans about me that I didn't even know? They talk about all these things about me before I even knew that they had plans. Well, this is way beyond that. Verse 16 tells me that God wrote down in a book every day that I would live, even before I even lived a day. Your translation might say something like, in your book, all my members were written. And that's certainly true. God wrote in code every part of us in our DNA before it was formed. But this is speaking, I think, even beyond that, to God also numbering our days and writing down our days before we even exist inside those days. Well, my parents couldn't do that. God is transcendent. My mom was just glad that I didn't die from eating the pennies out of the penny jar when I was 3. Let alone she had no idea what I'd be doing by the time I'm 50, right? Like, only the Lord knows that. But he knows it, and he wrote it down before I existed. This begs a couple theological questions, and the first is, if God has this much intentional care in creating us, are we really born with a sin nature? Well, of course we know that, yes, we are. God made Adam the father of the human race, by whom the whole world would be created. And we don't have time to go into this, all of the theology behind this today, but Adam was made in God's image, with God's delegated authority. And Romans 5 says, through one man's disobedience, the many were appointed sinners. And even so, through the obedience of one, the many will be appointed righteous. It's speaking of Adam and Jesus. Because of Adam's fallen headship, God made him the leader of the human race. We have all fallen because of that leadership. We are all a creation of Adam. But ultimately, we're a creation of God. And now, because of Christ's ultimate headship, his ultimate headship over all things and his perfect leadership, the regenerate ones who are reborn, regenerate by the Spirit, are made righteous by faith and appointed righteous because of the leadership of Christ and his obedience and his perfect righteousness in his very nature. That's another sermon, not for this morning. But then there's another question in this text. Has God really numbered someone's days before they exist? Well, David says that he has. So what if someone commits suicide or someone murders someone else? Does God's ordaining of our members in our days from eternity past take sin into account? Well, let me just answer that question with another question. For the God who intimately knows all things, holds every atom of the universe together, is there anything outside of God's providence? Providence, of course, being the overarching divine orchestration of everything that ever happens at all times. And the answer to that question is there's nothing outside of his providence. But there are things outside of God's responsibility. Think about that. Never outside his providence, but outside his responsibility, your sin. You and I are responsible for our sin within God's providence. Your sin is your responsibility. And you will give an account someday to the Lord. You and I both. God didn't sin. We did. But even within this responsibility, God's graciously offered to take that responsibility on himself in the gospel, right? The person of Christ. The very God who knew no sin became sin so that we might have the righteousness of Christ. The one who knew no sin could intimately know our sin. That's offered to us. The same all-knowing God to everyone in this room by faith is offered for him to know our sin and intimately know it and pay for it down to the very last theological penny that we might owe. That's a grace. We cannot attain to that kind of knowledge. Do you wrestle with these concepts? Well, I certainly did this week. Let me remind you, in this psalm, God's ways are unattainable for you and me. If you strive against these truths that God has passed down to us, we're striving against God. You might say, how is that fair? God making all these decisions about me in the womb without me. I didn't even get a chance to share an opinion. Well, you might be out from under your father's leadership, but you're never out from under God's leadership. Never. He formed you. He's your father. Your opinions don't carry much weight to the person who knows more about you than you know about yourself. It's like a father who makes plans with his child saying, hey, I'm going to put him in this room, and when he's 10, I'll move him out of that room. Right? God gets to make those decisions about when we exit this body, even in our death. And his leadership is perfectly informed. There's nowhere we can go where it doesn't exist. So all that's left is heartfelt gratitude and worship. In the very next verse, verse 17, David says he sees the value of God's thoughts towards him. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast the sum of them. And this is David's fourth realization in this psalm. The realization that God's leadership is infinitely thoughtful and valuable. That's amazing. Thoughtless, worthless leadership has been pervasive in the human race since Adam. But in case you were still tempted to discount God's leadership, his all-knowing, inescapable leadership that you and I display by our very nature, David starts to point out here the value of God's intentional, thoughtful leadership. I think it's amazing as I read this. It's another doxological realization stemming from God's hand in his own conception in the womb. The thoughtfulness of God is on David's mind. And he says they're precious, they're countless. It's like David is saying, God, your intentional direction and leadership, your thoughts about me, they have value. How precious are your thoughts? Do we treasure God's thoughts towards us often enough? Do we really? Do we treasure God's thoughts? Do they have value to us? Or do we try to manipulate God's thoughts about us? Are we angry with God's thoughts about us? Do we think God needs reminded about us? Well, we need to realize what David realized. The only way we can value God's thoughts is when by faith we believe that he truly knows more than us. He's really that intentional. His thoughts are perfectly informed. And last time I checked, I don't even know what it's like to have thoughts that are not tainted by sin or clouded by the sinful world. Only God has perfect thoughts with perfect knowledge. So David sees this. He says, if I could count your thoughts, Lord, they would be more than we could number. They would be more than the sand of the seashore. There's billions and billions and billions of grains of sand in this world. You could never count them all. And he says it's more than that. God actually thinks intentionally about me more than that. And go down to Galveston and try and count every grain of sand in that murky water. Never going to do it. Never. And that's just one beach. I told my son this week, I said, buddy, God thinks about you more than sand. And he was like, what? Dad, what? Yeah, God has more thoughts about you than there are grains of sand in the world. That's amazing. It's incredible. It's comforting. Now we have to understand the end of verse 18 though, because it seems really out of place. That David would say, when I am awake, I am with you. All of a sudden he just says, Lord, when I wake up, I'm here. It's about your thoughts and all your thoughts, and they're amazing. And now when I wake up, like, you're still here with me. What is he talking about? How is that related to God's thoughts? Well, let's put it this way. God's precious and innumerable thoughts are causing David to think about this and to think that he cannot escape God. And it actually gives him hope. It gives him hope in the resurrection. When I am awake, I am with you. I cannot escape God's leading presence in my life, even in the resurrection. When I rise from the dead, God is even there. It's not an if-then statement like before. This is a when-then. David's confident. When I awake, I'm with you. He's confident that when he wakes up in the resurrection, he is with God. And this idea of sleeping is all over the Old Testament, and it just points to death, unless it's like a narrative text. But in theological texts, it's death. So awakening in a text like this is the resurrection. And now David has, I think, the most striking realization of them all. David realizes in verse 19 how absolutely wicked it is to rise up against this kind of leadership from the God of the universe. And this is our fifth realization this morning, the wickedness of rejecting God's leadership. David realizes the wickedness of rejecting God's leadership. Look at this next section with me in context with the last section, beginning in verse 17. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I'm awake, I'm still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked. You're like, wow, what? David, what are we talking about? This is shocking. Oh, that you would slay the wicked. Oh, God, depart from me, therefore, you men of bloodshed. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do not I loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. That's very shocking to read. You're like, David, you were just coming from this amazing, contemplative place of worship. And what is driving you to such a drastic change in tone from sweet thoughts about God's care in the resurrection to his desire to obliterate the wicked? First, you have David awestruck at God's knowledge. Then you have him overwhelmed by the presence of God, wanting to flee from before the leadership of the Lord. And then you have him breaking out into doxologies about God's care for him and creating him and God's intentional thoughts towards him. And then you have him hopeful in the resurrection, and now he's wanting to kill people. David, really? Wow. You're like, David, what happened? You went from humble, sweet-spirited, thoughtful servant before God to a warrior ready to kill people with hatred in your heart. That's the words. That's the description. This might be one of the greatest contrasts of someone's demeanor in the entire Scriptures. So what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. It's right here in the context. After everything David has just been thinking on from God's leadership and his care, he realizes the absolute wickedness of what it means to rise up against this kind of leadership and authority from this kind of intentional God who knows all things, who guides perfectly, who protects, who's everywhere at all times, who cares for you intimately and knows every detail of your life. The God who has more thoughts about you than you could ever even imagine. And you want to rise up against that God? David says, Lord, would you slay them? He's indignant, and rightly so. These wicked people who try to raise themselves up against God and try and be their own God, don't they know they can't do that? That's impossible. It's a lie. And you see in David this desire to protect God's reputation in this moment. He says, oh God, slay the wicked because they speak against you. Don't you know your reputation is at stake? They take your name in vain. And in verse 19, after asking God to slay these people, David turns his focus to the wicked people, and he addresses them specifically. Knowing that Israel is going to sing this psalm out loud, he says, depart from me, therefore, you men of bloodshed, you bloodthirsty men. Wow. I think we should ask, why does David instantly associate these wicked men with bloodthirsty men? Well, think about it. What made Cain want to kill Abel? Cain worshiped himself instead of worshiping God, and Abel was in his way. Cain hated Abel. Ultimately, he hated God, and he hated God's leadership and authority that happened to be blessing Abel. That's why men become bloodthirsty. A self-exalted man can turn into a bloodthirsty man very quickly. Just give them a person who outshines them. David is righteous in this moment. I don't think there's sin here on David's part at all. He wants to get away from this kind of people, and you and I should too. He says, depart from me. If you find yourself enjoying the company of this type of person who raises themselves up against God and takes his name in vain, then you have a serious problem. Knowledge about God, a recognition of God's providential leadership in our lives, that should make us hate the wickedness of those who hate God. But David actually goes a step further than this. He doesn't just hate their wickedness. He says, I actually hate them who hate God. That's difficult to hear, but it's Bible. David says, do I not loathe those who loathe you, God? So the question here is David right in hating those who hate God? And the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes. He's righteous. He understands what the Apostle John warned about hundreds of years later, that friendship with the world is enemies of God. You either love God and hate his enemies, or you hate God. There's no middle ground. And the moment you start to feel familiar with the world, you're compromising. And David knows that. He says those who hate God, he hates them with the epitome of hatred. Now, what David is not saying is he's an angry man who wants to go out and just wickedly destroy them all. No, he understands God's providence, God's guiding care over all his creation, God's general love for everything that he's created. He's talking in specifics. If you could put all the righteous hatred possible inside of one heart, David had that. I don't know that we're that indignant about sin. Wow. If you have an anemic faith in the first part of this psalm, you're not going to understand this. This psalm is a progression of thoughts and responses designed to instruct our souls in how we should think and how we ought to follow the same progression of David. Verses 1 through 18 instructed David so that he got to this moment of saying, God's enemies are actually my enemies. I hate them with the utmost hatred. This should make us thankful, by the way, for our own salvation, because at one point we were all enemies of God, all of us, every single one of us, Romans 5. If you don't hate who you were without Christ as Lord in your life, then you're missing the point. So what's the final realization that we should come to in this psalm? This is our sixth realization, the final one here. Let me just give you the other ones again first, and I'll give you this final one. So realization 1 is the realization that God's leadership is perfectly informed. Perfectly informed. Realization 2 is that God's leadership is everywhere. It's unlike any other leadership. Every other leadership is finite. God's leadership is everywhere. Realization 3 is that God's leadership is evident in us. God's leadership is evident in us, regardless of whether we believe in Him or not. We are walking pedestals of God's leadership. Realization 4 is that God's leadership is infinitely thoughtful and valuable. Infinitely thoughtful and valuable. Realization 5 is realizing the wickedness of rejecting this leadership. And finally, our final realization this morning with David, as we get to realize these truths with him, is our need for God's leadership. Our absolute need for God's leadership. David circles back to where it all began at the beginning of the psalm. Verse 1, he says, God has already searched him and knows him. Now he's actually asking God to do this. He's not just making a statement that God does this. He wants it. He's inviting it. He sees the value of it, the need of it. He says, test me and know my anxious thoughts. He's referencing to the sifting that begins at the beginning of the psalm in verse 3. Test me, see where I pass and see where I fail. Know my thoughts, because I know there's holes there. Help me understand what they are. Test them. Even know the troubled ones that I might want to hide from you. He says anxious, troubled thoughts. And then David implores the Lord to see if there's any wicked way in him. See if there is any wicked way in me. The Hebrew here reads, if there's any painfully idolatrous way in me. Well, what's an idol? Anything that we raise up against God and hold equal to Him in our devotion, or above Him in our devotion. You might not even identify that you're giving your time and your devotion and your thought life and your energy to an idol, something that's taking the place of the Lord in your life. And David realizes that. He may not identify that. He needs the Lord to show him what that is, to illuminate him. And David prays for that. He wants to know. He doesn't just want to expose it to the Lord and keep going in it. So what does he say? See if there's any idolatrous way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. David is asking the Lord to lead him. He's submitting to it. It's really the perfect close to this psalm. 4 times explicitly in this psalm, David mentions God's leadership. But this is the only time that he's asking God for it. The only time. Lead me in the everlasting way. Hebrews 12:14 says, pursue sanctification, without which no one will see the Lord. That's the idea here. If you want to see God for who He is and see Him when you awake in the resurrection, you must pursue sanctification. And that's what David's doing. But it's even beyond that. He wants God's specific, intentional leadership in his life. He wants to know the way that leads to everlasting life that never ends, with this God that he's just learned to be in awe of in the whole psalm at a whole new level. What a statement to say this after you've just been praying for the destruction of wicked people. Lord, I need you to lead me in the way everlasting. I can't do that on my own. I'm just like them if you don't lead me. The way that lasts forever. See if there's anything in me, anything like those who hate you. See if there's anything in me. Check it out. Deal with it if it's there. Search me, know me, lead me. These are imperatives. It's not like David's giving God commands. Imperatives in the Old Testament are beseeching, imploring, they're requesting of God urgently. And David's saying, lead me. Just as you've led me all along, don't let me rebel against that kind of leadership. And it's really David here just praying that God would show him even the value of submitting to his leadership. God's leadership is inescapable, and it's a grace. We either disregard it to our harm or we embrace it to our eternal help. When was the last time that you prayed to the Lord like this? Wow. When was the last time you pursued sanctification in your prayers? Don't think that your circumstances either are outside of this, or your sin is outside of God's leadership abilities. It's not. And David in this psalm has the demeanor of a son who realizes the value of his father's inescapable, infinitely wise, all-knowing, perfect, careful leadership. And he wants it. Does that describe us? Is this how we live when we're contemplating truth? When no one can see our thoughts? I'll tell you what, I thought I would study this psalm and just find a lot of encouragement because it's always been an encouraging psalm to me since I was a child. But then I read it and I was like, there's all this in here? Wow. And I trembled before the Lord because these are weighty topics. Feeling a bit like Isaiah. I'm a man of unclean lips. There's holes that need shored up. But this psalm's here to help with that. So let me give you some just practical applications. As I just said, first and foremost, learn to desire God's providential and specific leadership. Desire it, want it. Cultivate a heart for that, a desire for it. Realize you need it. Cultivate that heart. Stop thinking you know what's best. We both know we don't know what's best. We know that. Your leadership of your life is not perfectly informed or perfect. So desire God's inescapable leadership. Secondly, men, if you're married, this should put a whole new light on what it means to live with your wife in an understanding way, according to knowledge. Wow. Peter instructs us to live with our wives according to knowledge. Does your leadership at home, does my leadership at home reflect this level of an intentional thought and care? Do we even have 10 intentional thoughts about our wives during the week? God leads with infinite thoughts. If we want to be leaders in our homes, we need to be thoughtful. We can't lead with infinite thoughts, but we can lead intentionally and thoughtfully and carefully. And our home can reflect the leadership of God. Trust me, I was convicted this week and spent some time seeking the Lord for ways I need to implement this text in my life. Let me encourage you, take your leadership cues from the Lord because his leadership's perfect. Whether it's at home or in church or in the workplace, learn to lead from the Lord. And thirdly, even as Christians, we might struggle with God leading us into a bitter providence. What do we do with that? There's a lot of examples of this all throughout history, right? Even in the Old Testament especially, there's scriptures, but in the New Testament, all over the place. In church history, everywhere, we see people struggle with God's providence. Naomi in the book of Ruth is one of those. Asaph, David's own music leader, who would sing this psalm. It's almost like David knew. Asaph struggled with this. He started envying the wicked and getting bitter at God for his own circumstances. But if we're believers and we claim to be loving the Lord in everything, we don't get to choose what we love about him. We must learn to love his providence, his leadership, because we're convinced that he knows best. Pursue it. Embrace it. It's for our good. And finally, let me just say to those of you who have children, I was comforted by this psalm, actually. I love my kids, and I want the Lord to lead them in righteousness in the middle of a wicked world when I know their hearts are sinful. But after studying this psalm, it has actually deepened my trust in the Lord, that he's going to care for my kids. He's ultimately way more intentional than I can be. He knows them better than I do. His care for them is far better than I could ever care for them. But it's also convicting because I want to lead that way. I want to love my kids the way God would love them. And we get to model that for them. Think about that. We get to model a love for God's leadership in our lives that helps our kids learn to love God's leadership. And if we do that, they're going to love our leadership at home, moms and dads. So let's embrace the intentional care and leadership of our God this week. Let me pray, and we'll close out our time. Gracious Lord, thank you for your care for us. We're struck by your thoughtfulness, the grace of your leadership in our lives. Just the amazing truth, Lord, that you are leading us beyond what we can comprehend. Help us submit to that. Help us walk in faithfulness to it. Help us be submitted to it in every area of our lives, Lord. Whatever those thoughts are in our minds that we have become friends with, that we need to cut off those relationships because they're enemies of you. Help us do that. Lord, help us walk in faithfulness and in righteousness. Would you bless the rest of our time this morning and be with Pastor Darren as well this week, Lord, as he's coming back to Houston. Thank you for your care for us. In Jesus' name, amen.